Welcome to BookEnds Online Edition, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Story Seller in collaboration with the New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. BookEnds is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. BookEnds programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org or subscribe on YouTube. Today's program will be available shortly. Next month's BookEnds will be held Saturday, October 8th, 2022 at 11:30 a.m. and will feature Margaret Shaw Johnson, who will talk about her book, The Haunting of Potter's Field. This month's speaker is Laura Michelle Diener.
Yes.
She recently received an award for her proposal of a biography of the Nobel Prize-winning writer Sigrid Undset. Laura earned her doctorate in history at Ohio State University in 2008. She teaches medieval and ancient history at Marshall University in West Virginia. Her academic work focuses on women as authors and artists in the Middle Ages. Sigrid Undset's gift was to take readers inside the hearts and minds of people who lived, worked, struggled, and connived in the villages of 13th century Norway. In this new translation of Olav Audunssøn, the characters come to life in clear, lyrical prose. When you have the time, read it and spend time in the 13th century as it really was. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to enter them through chat. Now, let's welcome to BookEnds Online Edition, Laura Michelle Diener.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the Wadena County Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to discuss some of my favorite novels, Vows, Providence, and Crossroads, and the final sequel are sometimes known as the Master of Hesteviken series or the Olav Audunsson, and they are available in haunting, spectacular new translations by renowned translator Tiina Nunnally through University of Minnesota Press. I read them first in the original translation from the 1920s as a young girl, and I've recently reread them as part of my research into the life of their author, Sigrid Undset. She wrote all four books in over just 5 years during the 1920s and considered them her best works. The Olav Audunssøn books are historical novels set in a turbulent, dramatic period of Scandinavian history after the reign of the long-lived King Håkon IV. The novels end with a reference to the Black Death, an epidemic that devastated Norway, reducing its population by about half and leading to the loss of political independence to Denmark, a position that wouldn't change until after the Napoleonic Wars. Sigrid Undset had meticulously researched the Middle Ages and was a voracious reader of medieval literature. Her novels reveal the influence of the Icelandic Norse sagas set in Viking days. Honor, vengeance, and the ties of kinsmen dominate the plots. Characters unwittingly get caught up in cycles of broken bonds and bloodshed. Undset also incorporated themes from Norse mythology, from the Bible, from Shakespearean dramas, and wove them together into a rich tale centered around two star-crossed lovers. The vast amount of scholarship behind these novels is really so remarkable when we consider that Sigrid Undset never attended university and had left school at the age of 16. Her education was unconventional from the start and began with her father, Ingvald Undset, a renowned Norwegian archaeologist famous for his research into Europe's Iron Age culture. Sigrid grew up surrounded by artifacts, books, and photographs of a newly discovered ancient world. They were as normal to her as toys. Among her first words were blunt-headed axe and shaft-hole axe. She enjoyed regaling the neighborhood children with the contents of their sitting room cabinet, including half a bronze sword with some arrowheads, glass bottles from Egyptian tombs, and in pride of place, an Etruscan funerary urn complete with incinerated remains. Her father taught her to read medieval literature in the original languages. They spent a great deal of time together as his health declined. Before her birth, he'd contracted some sort of illness, possibly malaria. And by the time Sigrid turned 10, her father was unable to do much more than lay in bed and converse with his eldest daughter. Although these moments were tinged with inevitable sadness, she would remember them as formative for her lifelong interest in Scandinavia's medieval past. She would read out loud to him from Old Norse sagas while he corrected her pronunciation. Her last memories of her father were tied up with the beautiful melancholy of Old Norse poetry. He died in December of 1893 at the age of 40 when she was 11 years old. With his death, Sigrid, her two younger sisters, and their mother faced utter penury with no regular income coming in. Their school kept on the three sisters with full scholarships, but Sigrid resented being the recipient of charity. She found her school subjects less interesting than anything she could read on her own, and she neither excelled at her studies nor made friends. She also had no real desire to succeed academically because she thought she would end up as a teacher, which was one of the main options for bright girls of her generation. So her disrespectful behavior at school got her into trouble, and at 15, she lost her scholarship. She wanted to be a painter, but to support her family, she took a one-year secretarial course, and at 16 years old, took a job as a secretary for an engineering company. She found her new career deadly dull, which isn't surprising, but ironically, she considered it the beginning of her career as an author. To escape from her dreary job, she immersed herself into a world of dreams and beauty. And she filled her spare time with reading, with studying languages, and with writing down the stories that began to consume her. She adored the historical romances of Bernard Severin Ingemann. He wrote the first historical novels in Danish set in tumultuous medieval Denmark. And these novels are thrilling yarns of knightly adventures and royal intrigue, and they're very similar to his contemporary Sir Walter Scott, so novels like Ivanhoe and Rob Roy. At the age of 18, Sigrid began working on two huge, intricate romances of her own based on minor characters who appeared in Bernard Ingemann's novels, much the way that we write fan fiction today. These characters eventually took on lives and families of their own. And in the second romance, which she titled Olga Nielsen, that would actually develop into the Olav Audunsson novels. She actually outlined the plot in a letter to her pen pal in 6 pages, a massive epic of unhappy love over 3 generations. And it's striking to see how she'd created, this was around the age of 20, really the entirety of the 4 novel series she would only complete in her early 40s. But as her writing flourished, her days at the office stagnated and her future looked grim. By her early 20s, she worried that she would never be a true artist, never fall in love, and that her life would remain in the same tedious patterns. It didn't help that in 1905, Olga Nielsen, the title of the first version of the Olav novels, was rejected by a publisher. In despair, she began working on a modern novel at her publisher's suggestion. And so it was that at age 25, she achieved authorial success with the publication of Fra Marta Oli, followed by several other contemporary novels and short stories. Their profits, along with a travel grant, allowed her to quit her secretarial job. And in 1909, at the age of 27, she traveled to Italy for the first time. Not surprisingly, it changed her life forever. In many ways, she was wise beyond her years. She was mature, she was responsible, she was learned, unbelievably intelligent, but she was also quite inexperienced romantically. She'd never lived on her own, and she longed to experience adventure and emotion on a par with the characters in her imagination. So it's no surprise that during her first months in Rome, she fell irrevocably in love with a most unsuitable man, Anders Svarstad, also a Norwegian, 13 years older than her, an artist living in boarding houses and seeking inspiration in Italian cityscapes. He had left a wife and 3 young children behind in Norway with no means of support. None of these factors proved an impediment to passion. Despite every obstacle, Svarstad was able to eventually obtain a divorce, and the two married in 1912. Sigrid was pregnant at their wedding, and she used her experiences of hiding a pregnancy from family and friends in several of her later medieval novels. Their marriage was passionate but tumultuous. In addition to her writing, Sigrid took on the care of her 3 stepchildren, the youngest of whom was a mentally disabled boy who required round-the-clock care. Their mother was unfit and to care for them, and Anders likewise was disinclined to live with his family, preferring the freedom to paint in solitude. Sigrid kept her own home, and he usually kept his own apartment. The family continued to grow, with Sigrid giving birth to 3 children of her own, Anders, Maren Charlotte, and Hans. Maren Charlotte was born severely mentally disabled and would never learn to speak more than a handful of words. And the strain of caring for her, along with her stepchildren, led to the dissolution of the marriage. In 1919, she separated from Anders and moved to Lillehammer with her children, where she would live for the next several decades. She wrote constantly to keep them all afloat financially, staying up long into the night, smoking and drinking black coffee. The children would wake her after a few hours sleep at 7 in the morning, but she would continue to lay in bed until noon, reading and researching in old medieval texts. It was at her Lillehammer home that she produced her most famous work, the 3 Kristin Lavransdatter books, which brought her financial success, international acclaim, and a devoted readership that continues to this day. Her 3 novels, Kransen, The Wreath, came out in 1920, Husfru, The Wife in 1921, and then Corset, The Cross in 1922. But despite how beloved those books are, Sigrid herself preferred the books she would write next about Olav Audunsson. She even resented the attention that the Kristin books received over what she considered her greatest writing. The first 2 Olav books followed the Kristin books. They were published in 1925 when she was 43 years old, and volumes 3 and 4 came out in 1927. Writing these volumes was a revisiting for her of the tortured romance that she had first envisioned in her early 20s and that publisher had rejected. She changed the names of the characters, transplanted the setting from Denmark to Norway, and in the process produced gorgeous natural descriptions that really give the Tetrarchy its unique character. Whereas the story of Kristin is firmly rooted in valleys and farmland, the Olav books are so much about the sea, the shore, the fjords, and they give the books much of their wild and restless character. The Tetrarchy follows 2 families over 3 generations, centering around the love between Olav Audunsson and Ingunn Steinfinnsdatter, who grow up together as foster siblings and are betrothed to marry. The desires and greed of their families throw their lives into chaos. In medieval Scandinavia, the law was based specific legal formulas that one had to adhere to after committing a crime. These involved announcing the crime, calling witnesses, asking respected men to speak for you, and rather than death or imprisonment, the sentence could include paying restitution to the victim's family and undergoing a specific period of outlawry. And those laws existed during the Viking Age and carried over into the 13th century. Olav and Ingunn live out the consequences of their family's actions, and the effects of their own betrayal spill into the next generation as well. The story begins with their fathers, two men, Audun and Steinfinn, serving at the court of the old king Håkon IV. They who served the young queen Ingebjorg, who's a Danish princess married to the heir to the throne. And this was all meticulously researched. The queen herself arranges the marriage of Cecilia Bjornsdottir to Audun, a silent man who takes his young bride to his home estate Hestviken on the Oslo fjords and sails off to serve the king in Scotland. Cecilia dies in childbirth, but her infant son Olav survives. Steinfinn's love for Ingebjorg Jonsdottir is a star-crossed romance as she is betrothed to another man, Matthias. When Matthias refuses to release her from her engagement, she elopes with Steinfinn. The two live together joyously and have many children. Their eldest daughter is a pretty little girl named Ingunn. The two families meet again when their children are 6 and 7. The adults drink and catch up on old times while their children play together happily. Audun reveals that he is dying and about to leave his young son an orphan but heir to a great estate. The two men agree their children will marry and that Olav will live as a foster son to his new family. He returns home with Steinfinn and grows up as a son of the household. But a few years later, Matthias, the jilted fiancé, exacts his revenge upon Steinfinn, invading the house at night and humiliating the couple. Afterwards, Steinfinn plots revenge while his wife shuts herself away in mourning. The household falls into disarray and the children are left to raise themselves. Olav and Ingunn, like brother and sister, fight, play, and explore without much interest in their future. But their world turns upside down when they are in their early teens. Steinfinn gathers together his relatives and servants and attacks Matthias, burning his home. He is triumphant but dies from his wounds, leaving the future of his children in jeopardy. Olav and Ingunn turn to each other and realize their deep burgeoning love. They find comfort in the knowledge of their future marriage, but Ingunn's conniving relatives attempt to dismiss the betrothal, thinking they could find her a better match. Words are exchanged and swords are crossed, and Olav ends up slaying Ingunn's cousin in a quick, heated fight. Olav becomes an outlaw and must stay abroad until he can earn the restitution for the killing. He and Ingunn vow to remain true to each other. Olav joins the retinue of a powerful earl and ends up staying abroad for 7 years. And Olav and Ingunn in these families are fictional, but the earl he serves is a historical figure. Olav enjoys himself immensely learning the arts of war and adventuring with other men. Those years apart, though, are infinitely harder on Ingunn, who lives as a disgraced spinster alone with distant relatives. She remains steadfast to Olav, even refusing an advantageous marriage offer. But increasingly bored and lonely, she briefly welcomes the attentions of a visiting Icelandic scribe, Tate Halsson, and to her absolute horror, she falls pregnant. Only a few months after her discovery, Olav returns, ready to claim her at last. He receives the news with bitterness, but shocks everyone by demanding to proceed with the marriage and planning to pass the child off as his own. But first, he must take care of loose ends. When he learns that Tate has been spreading rumors about his brief liaison with Ingunn, he seeks out the man and slays him with his ancestral axe. Determined to protect Ingunn's reputation, he does not declare the killing and offer to pay restitution, but rather hides the body. He acted out of love, but the consequences of this undeclared murder will haunt the rest of his days. Ingunn gives birth to a son, Eric. She is despondent, she cannot be comfortable, and even tries to drown herself in a lake. The boy is sent to a foster nurse, and after her suicide attempt, Olav realizes how much he still loves her. They marry at last and depart for his ancestral estate of Hestviken. They truly love each other, but are unable to find marital happiness. Ingunn gives birth to several sons who all die in infancy. Grief overwhelms her, and she mourns incessantly for her lost son. Unable to bear his wife's sorrow, Olav actually brings home the now 4-year-old Eric, claiming him as his own. Ingunn is delighted and eventually gives birth to a healthy, thriving daughter, Cecilia. But this last birth destroys her health, and she never recovers from childbirth. She lays paralyzed for over a year, and Olav turns briefly for comfort to a capable serving woman, Torvhild, who becomes pregnant. He sends her away, though, to please Ingunn, and later learns she gave birth to a baby boy, Björn. So at the close of the second book, Ingunn dies, leaving her husband brokenhearted, and he must now grapple with his motherless children, including this alien son who will inherit his name and his estate. So these two novels came out in 1925. The year before, Sigrid Undset, who was 42, had officially separated from her husband and converted to Catholicism. So her Catholicism was really a surprising move for a Norwegian at the time. Catholics were definitely in the minority in this overwhelmingly Lutheran country, but this was not the case in the time of Olav and Ingunn and Kristin Lavransdatter. During the 13th and 14th century, all Norwegians were Catholics, and pilgrims traveled from all over Europe to visit the magnificent Gothic cathedral in Nidaros, dedicated to the Viking king, King Olav Haraldsson, who's known as Saint Olaf. The archbishop at Nidaros oversaw 10 bishops throughout the country, as well as in the Norse-controlled islands in the North Atlantic. But as with so many aspects of Norway's medieval past, the fortunes of the Catholic Church plummeted abruptly with the Black Death. The epidemic spared neither priests nor lay people, and just in Nidaros alone, about 70% of the town's 3,000 residents died in a matter of weeks. After a union with Denmark in 1397, the Danish language and religious leaders took preeminence, a process completed during the Danish-driven Reformation of the 16th century, which basically rendered the Norwegian church irrelevant. But Sigrid's exploration into her country's medieval past had led her to deep appreciation of its Catholic roots. She genuinely appreciated Norse paganism and saw a natural transition between paganism to Christianity that preserved much of what was unique about early medieval Scandinavian character. And she saw the Reformation as a harsh break with this. As a young woman, she had also lived in Rome for several years and was not only amazed by the centuries of art and culture, but began to nourish deep spiritual longings. Her conversion shocked the majority of her reading public, and it would remain a point of criticism against her. But nevertheless, it undoubtedly enriched her characters. She was able to create not only medieval settings, but medieval souls. Olaf, in particular, remains caught in endless conflicts between his honor and his duty, between law and morality, and between revenge and atonement. So between legal, sort of Viking age concepts and Christian morality. In the last two books, his struggles to raise Eric after Ingunn's death encapsulate all these internal battles. Eric is a constant reminder of Ingunn's infidelity, Tate's undeclared murder, and Olav's unconfessed sin. Olav can never reveal the truth without dishonoring the memory of his beloved Ingunn and betraying her child, but this dilemma confounds him, who knows that his illegitimate but actual biological son, Björn, is growing up far away, the living image of his father, but with no legal rights to Hestviken. Eric grows up as a lively and imaginative boy, prone to fantasy, bragging, and mischief, but nevertheless good-hearted. He absolutely adores the man he knows as his father and constantly seeks his attention and approval. Olav attempts to be kind to Eric, but his sorrow causes him to withdraw from both his children. Frustrated at his father's coldness, Eric runs off to serve a noble lord, much as Olav had done in his youth. Later, he attempts to join a monastery, but realizes he is not yet suited for such a life. Olav finally arranges a match for him with a well-born young woman, Gunhild Bersadottir, and the two grow fond of each other. Cecilia grows up to be a spitfire who reminds her adoring father of his Viking ancestors. Olav treasures his daughter, but nevertheless refuses her request to marry a lowly born young man serving at Hestviken, and instead betroths her to Jorund, a noble friend of Eric's. Jorund beats Cecilia, causing her to give birth early, and his behavior becomes more unhinged and violent. His criminal actions reflect so poorly on his family that Gunhilda's father actually breaks off her betrothal to Eric. Gunhilda is a very willful young woman, and she informs Eric that she will run away if her father doesn't change his mind. Eric has finally gained maturity and he's more inclined to be cautious and consider her honor, but she ignores him and sends word that she has run off and he must seek her at the home of her much older half-sister, Eldre, a disgraced woman who had run away from her husband 15 years before and lives estranged from her family on her own in a cottage like a peasant. With a heavy heart, Eric realizes that he must protect Gunhilda's reputation despite his unwillingness to once again cross her father and disappoint his own. He rushes to the home of his sister, only Gunhilda never shows up, having jilted him to marry the man chosen by her father. But her sister, Eldre, is a beautiful middle-aged woman overflowing with bitterness at her life. She at first despises Eric, as she does all men. Eric learns that she was married as a very young teenager to a cruel older man who tormented her, and that she ran away to escape the horrors of her life, thus losing her family, her status, and her inheritance. Eric, while waiting for Gunhilda to possibly show up, helps her, Audrey bring in her crops and falls in love with her, realizing she is the woman he was fated to find and cherish. Despite Olav's disapproval, he acts with honor and insists on marrying her and tending to her farm. All of this changes when Jorund is murdered, and Olav is convinced that Cecilia has done it and that he has passed his sin to his daughter. He learns it was a faithful family servant and Cecilia is innocent, and the shock causes him to suffer a stroke. During his last years, he loses his speech and movement in his right side. Eric and Eldre care for him faithfully. As Olaf lays dying, Cecilia, now married to her long ago childhood sweetheart, comes to visit. Eric chides her for not forgiving their father, for thinking she was a murderess. And surprised, she explains that she's forgiven him and that she stayed away because she cannot bear to see her strong, beloved father so stricken. Eric agrees. He affirms what a good man their father has always been and informs his sister that he plans to join a monastery to pray for their father's soul. Olav overhears this conversation in his dying moments. So Eric never learns the truth about his birth and always tells his family of the noble deeds of his father. With no children, he is more than happy that Hestviken will pass to Cecilia's children, who are, unbeknownst to him, the true ancestral heirs. The love between the two siblings stands out as one of the strongest relationships in the book, and the failings of their parents, themselves brought on by the crimes of their own parents, are finally redeemed in their grown children. Throughout the four novels, Olav's unconfessed sins destroyed his happiness, and he believed he continually turned from God and made the wrong decisions. But as we reach the conclusion, we realize that his silent sufferings allowed Eric and Cecilia to write their lives, to live with honor, and eventually find love. And Olav died a respected man, surrounded by his family, who really never realized the extent of his inner struggles. So after the publication of this last Olav Audunsson book, Sigrid Undset received the Nobel Prize. She'd actually been nominated 4 times previously, going back to 1922, but was rejected for various reasons, mainly her intense focus on female emotions. One critic wrote, "With great admiration for Sigrid Undset's indefatigable and rich narrative art, a man, at least, cannot help growing weary of the stormy and complicated stories of women's lives." But of course, it's that very intimacy that was the key to her novel's popularity. The year she won was actually incredibly contested. There was another many times nominee, the Russian Maxim Gorky. He was controversial because of his Bolshevik connections. Undset was also controversial because of her Catholicism, which was not popular. And there was also Henri Bergson, who was a French philosopher, who was nominated. So finally, on November 13th, 1928, it was awarded both to Bergson and to Sigrid Undset. Bergson for 1927 and her for 1928, but given at the same time, for her powerful depictions of life during the Middle Ages in the North. So after the Nobel Prize, she left the Middle Ages behind for a while. She spent the next 2 years on a 2-volume story of conversion, family, and politics, set in the beginnings of the 20th century. And for the rest of the 1930s, her novels were in the 20th century. There's one 18th century one, but she does not return to the Middle Ages. So with the turn of the new year in 1939, all of this changed. Her sort of contented life in her home in Lillehammer as a successful, internationally renowned writer. Her daughter died at the age of 23, followed by the death of her mother that August at the age of 84. And along with her personal tragedies, the world was in turmoil. The Nazis invaded Norway on April 9th, 1940. Sigrid's reputation in Germany, where her novels had been incredibly popular, had allowed her a voice in German magazines, and she had spoken out vociferously against the rise of the Nazi Party. And this led to her being, considered a person of danger during the invasion. She was advised to flee immediately, which she did, to the point that she didn't realize that her eldest son had actually died early in 1940 during one of the first battles of the invasion. She ends up fleeing first to Sweden, then across Soviet Russia to Japan, and finally the United States, where she spends the war years in Brooklyn. During those years, she formed deep ties with probably a number of American intellectuals that are well known to all of you, including Willa Cather and Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, the author of The Yearling, the social activist Dorothy Day, and the publisher Alfred Knopf and his wife Blanche. During those years, she used her reputation, which she was really internationally famous. Someone to the equivalent, someone like Margaret Atwood or Stephen King today. And so she used her reputation to advocate for American entry into the war, and later to call attention to the plight of Jewish refugees and to encourage America to come to their aid. And she remained quite an active writer. Instead of novels, she ended up focusing on essays and articles and nonfiction works about the nature of democracy and the threat of totalitarianism. She did dream of returning to Norway, but when she was finally able to obtain passage in the summer of 1945, she found a country utterly ravaged by war, She had lost many family members. Her two elder children were dead. Her home had been commandeered as the local Gestapo headquarters, and many of her books and furniture had been burned for fuel. So her last years did contain a great deal of unhappiness, but she remained fiery, difficult, and deeply invested in political questions of the day. And she died in 1949 after a life as passionate and eventful as her immortal medieval characters. And speaking of eventful, it may seem that I told you everything there was to know about the Olav Audunsson novels, but I actually left out a great deal, including many of the smaller plots, many of the side characters, a great deal of the traveling. So please don't think I've spoiled them for you. And I encourage you to go ahead and read them for yourself. So thank you. That's everything I wanted to share right away, but now I'd love to take some questions. Oh, and it looks like I got one in the chat box. Okay, so I've read, okay, Marta, Uli, are there similar themes of women's agency and independence in these novels? That's a really good question, because probably from what I was saying, you might be a bit surprised that the main female character is Ingun, who is really kind of a weak, somewhat pathetic character. I mean, she's a sympathetic character, but no one would describe her as, you know, an independent woman with a lot of agency. But a number of the other female characters are much more what we would consider to be independent. Her daughter Cecilia, who's a huge focus of the fourth book, is really quite determined and independent, and her father always says she should have been the man of the family. She's very decisive. She's very concerned with her family's honor, so she accepts a marriage that she's not really happy with, but after it ends, she actually, Olav and Eric try to arrange another marriage for her, and she just absolutely refuses and says she's gonna do what she's going to do. And Eric's wife only appears briefly in the last part of the last novel, but is one of the most memorable characters. So in fact, Ingun, it kind of stands out as being really the only woman who's not particularly, independent. Now, of course, it's the Middle Ages. They're not going to be independent, like they want their own careers and the right to vote and all of that. But they have a great deal of agency in the sense that, you know, they're very careful of their own honor and their family's honor, and they can act very willfully, to kind of get what they want, and they're very similar to Viking heroines that appear in the sagas, where they don't necessarily go into battle themselves, but they're sort of behind the scenes arranging all the feuds. Let's see, it sounds like the novels compare with the Canterbury Tales. Definitely. And Sigrid was a huge fan of the Canterbury Tales. She read them in Middle English, which, my students struggle with Middle English, and they're native English speakers. So she learned to read them in Middle English, and she had to learn like modern English first. But she was very self-taught, probably the years when she was a secretary. It's almost equivalent to like a university education for us. I mean, she would just sort of devote all her free time to learning languages and reading incredibly old books. Her drive is really quite amazing. So, other questions?
Do you have a paragraph or two from the first novel that you could read to give us a little flavor of the novel?
Sure, I think so. Let's see. I actually have them all on PDF. So if I can call one up really quickly, I would be happy to. So I don't know that I actually have the first novel in the new translation. I do have the third novel. So
Well, I
if
see
that'll,
that we have the translator here on the Zoom meeting.
oh yes, I'm sure she has a copy if she'd like to read a paragraph.
Well,
No, hi. Wait, I'll get my picture up here too. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. No, I mean, I hadn't planned to read or speak at all, so I can't really help you with that. But yeah, I'm just really interested to hear Laura Michelle's take on Olaf as a character without giving away anything more about the ending.
Mhm.
But he's a very conflicted man who also is a very spiritual person. And for me, the third volume, Crossroads, which is coming out soon, is really the most spiritual, the deepest, the most emotional. And I wonder about your opinion, Laura Michelle.
Well, yes, when I gave that huge sweeping outline of the plot, actually 99% of what I spoke of was in the first two volumes, and then the fourth one. There was really very little to say plot-wise about the third one, because it's so much about Olaf's like interior world that there's very little movement or action between the characters. He's deeply spiritual, he's deeply tormented, and at times throughout the books I think readers might get a little bit frustrated with him because of his inability to ever resolve conflicts, it seems like. But I think as the books progress, as you move into the third one and the fourth one, you realize that he's really no different from anyone else. He's very human, and it's just a full exploration into the state of his soul, and that we all have those struggles and conflicts that are unresolved throughout our lives. They're just rarely explored so articulately. So I think he's a very sympathetic character, not necessarily perhaps as immediately popular as Kristen Lavransdatter is. And I read a letter that Sigrid Undset's mother, Charlotte, wrote to her sister about having read the drafts of the novels. And she says, "No, I loved these. I can already tell they're not going to be as popular because there's less action. And instead," she says, "they dive into the deep depths." And so she predicts that they won't be as popular, but she thinks that they're actually better. So I think, the more one reads them, the more one appreciates what a complex and human character he is.
Yeah, I
So
totally agree. Yeah.
since we've gotten the translator here, I was wondering if, even though you weren't really prepared to speak, if you would mind sharing with us just a little bit about the translation process. It's always exciting to think about how you take from one language into another, and it, and carry that spirit, the spirit of these amazing characters, and to keep true to that in a new language.
Well, I've translated so many of Sigrid Undset's books now that I feel like I know her style pretty well, especially with the medieval novels. So that's very helpful, because every time you start a new book by a new author, you have to learn to listen to their voice and the voice of the book. So it's been really helpful that I've done so many of Sigrid Undset's books and love her work so much. But The thing about her books is that she's very, very particular about her word choice. When she describes nature, it's very specific. She doesn't just say, you know, a yellow flower. She's very specific about the kind of flower and where it was could be found in Norway. So it takes a lot of research to translate her books. I have to look up the Latin names of plants and then find the English. And sometimes she uses words that are very particular to a part of Norway. So I have to ask my Norwegian friends what this could mean. She was, as Laura Michelle said, did amazing research about medieval times. And so I have to make sure I get the right terms for the housing, the clothing, the tools, the weapons. I learned a lot about swords and castles and warfare in medieval times, just in order to maybe get one sentence correct. So it's very time consuming and incredibly interesting and fun. I've learned a lot just by doing her books. Yeah, and then she is so specific also about the interior life of her characters. And I want to make sure that I can capture that in English, which is not an easy thing to do. And then she also uses a lot of Latin because the times are Catholic. And so I've had to look up a lot of biblical quotes and Latin phrases and see how those phrases might have been used in the Catholic Church in medieval times in Europe. So it's a very complicated process, not the usual translation process. I mean, I've translated a lot of contemporary authors, a lot of murder mysteries, and those are usually pretty straightforward. Sigrid Undset requires a lot of focus and concentration and a lot of research.
So going back, Laura Michelle, looking at Sigrid Undset's work and her deep exploration of the interior life of her characters, I think in a way it's like her writing style and the focus of her novels it's almost come full circle, and it's uniquely relevant to what we're reading today coming out of literary fiction.
Sir, I think so. You know, her books are never really dated. I think that's something that's very spectacular about them. Every time you read them, they're fresh. I mean, I think they feel modern. So, you know, to research the background of some of her medieval novels, I read some of the books that she had read, including all the novels of Bernard Ingman, which I enjoyed them immensely, but they are very dated. They would not work in today's audience. You know, there's this very sort of like Renaissance, pseudo-Renaissance-y language, and you know, everyone sort of has these Victorian morals and all of that. And her works are not like that. They're incredibly fresh. The relationships are, I think this is something she was remarkable at. They're both so set in their times, but also so human. They transcend that. In her Kristin Lavransdatter novels, for example, some of the most lasting images, I think, are the love between Kristin and her children. And, you know, you don't have to be living in the Middle Ages or living in the 1920s or even a mother to feel the power of those images. They seem to transcend time, while at the same time, she's able to, you know, give us this incredibly accurate picture of, you know, childbirth at the time that, you know, is very much, in its own particular context. I know too that I have read all of these novels multiple times, and they hold up. So the plots are great, but that's why Lina asked me to kind of give a big overview of the plots, and at first I thought, well, I don't want to give anything away, and then I realized it doesn't matter, because the joy in reading them is not about, well, what's going to happen next. It's about how it all unfolds. It's it's the interiority of the characters, and that never gets old. I've probably read the Kristen novels, I don't know, 5 times, and each time it's fresh. I realize something new. I mentioned Margaret Atwood before, just to kind of indicate how famous she was in her lifetime, but she's always reminded me of Margaret Atwood as well, a little bit, because she writes with a tinge sometimes of fantasy and history, but always seems to be relevant. There's always something in there that makes you think of what's going on in your own time.
Wonderful. I don't know that I have any other questions. I don't know if anything is, I don't see anything that's come through in the chat. Shelley has a question.
What led you to like led to your interest in this woman in her novels? Like, how did you discover them?
Well, I discovered them when I was in college. I had a job at, I was a seamstress, and this woman came into the sewing shop one day, and she was there to work, like she'd been hired, and we had a brief conversation, and I told her I was studying the Middle Ages. I was a medieval studies major, and she said, "Oh, have you read these novels? I think you'll like them." And then she left for her lunch break, and I never saw her again. She never came back. So if you've read the Kristen novels, I was like, is she the elf queen? Like, and she came into my life for 1 second, and it was so faded. But I went and I read those novels, and I loved them. They were always, among my favorites. And, this was sort of pre-internet, so I really didn't have access to a lot of the other things that she wrote. Then over the years, I've read more, and then Tiina's new translation came out, which allowed me to kind of revisit them. And I've always wanted to learn more about her. If you just Google her, you get these little tantalizing bits of information. And there's a bit of biographical information included in Tiina's translations, like the introduction. And I was like, what? She was pregnant and had to hide it just like Kristen? Like, who is this woman? So I thought, I'll get a biography of her. And I couldn't find one that was in English. So I thought I'd have to write one so I could read it. But in the process too, there's been all kinds of intriguing connections. I don't study Norway, medieval Norway a bit, but I'm not a scholar certainly of modern Norway. Didn't know Norwegian, and I've never been to Norway. But during her years in America, she was acquainted with all of these well-known intellectuals, and so there's information about her in archives all over the US in English. That was really my first foray into researching her. I'm very interested in Dorothy Day, and in the Dorothy Day archive at Marquette University, there's a whole box on Sigrid Undset and their correspondence. Same with Willa Cather. So I had not expected that, and that was sort of a delightful way for me to begin studying her life, almost like from my perspective, before I even got into her past and her life in Norway.
Yeah, it seems interesting. The books sound really interesting, and then you think, oh, and then she's fleeing from the Nazis because she had the courage to speak out, and then, oops, here they come. Does it say anything about how she managed to escape, or was she able to get out earlier? Or
So she writes a book when she's in America called Return to the Future, and it details that whole time in her life, how she's able to escape. It's pretty adventurous. She has to, like, she's in her nightgown and she's on skis and, leaving, just kind of with 5 minutes notice. And she has to take a train across Soviet Russia, which is fascinating because, most people didn't really get that kind of exposure to Soviet Russia. She's there for several weeks. And, so this is under Stalin, but before they've entered the war. And she writes about everything she sees. And it's really intriguing to look at that. And then, she's in Japan and Korea. So that's actually a very interesting sort of nonfiction work of hers, Return to the Future, which is in print. So I know I've gotten copies off of Amazon. And it's kind of horrible what happened to her, but at the same time, she even admits it probably was in some ways the best thing that happened to her, because she was so devastated. She loses 2 of her children and her mother, within the same year. And so if she hadn't had to do that, she says, like, she didn't even know how she would have coped with grief, but she had this mission now to kind of tell people in the United States, about how horrible the Nazis were and how they needed to enter the war. And that becomes her new passion.
Is there things on how that was received? Because I know at that point in America, there was a huge America First movement and a lot of support also from some sectors for the Germans and the Nazis. Mm-hmm. And so there.
Yeah, she described that in a lot of times in her correspondence. So as soon as she arrived, she's sort of taken in by sort of prominent Catholic families who are huge fans of hers. And Dorothy Day is probably the most famous, of the sort of Catholic social activists that she encounters. And most of them are they are pacifists, and they do not want America to enter the war. And that's somewhere that she really clashes with them. She spends some time at the Catholic Worker, which is Dorothy Day's kind of institution in New York, and you can read sort of interviews with people who volunteered there, and they reference like her kind of shutting down Peter Marin and all these people who are sort of being very idealistic about pacifism, and she's just sort of will like thunder in and just be like, I do not agree, that is not true, and shut them down. So yeah, her views were not were not always well received. They also tended to she always complained because people wanted her to sort of keep they wanted her to speak at the Norwegian Daughters Ladies Guild and all of that. And she saw her work as, much more serious, much more important.
Yeah, and it turns out she was right.
Yeah, absolutely. She was right. And she, eventually, America joins the war. And then it becomes all about her advocating for refugees. She joins this group that it's a number of incredibly famous people, like the Barrymores, they're all sort of Hollywood and stage celebrities, and her that are sort of going around sort of speaking, and they write a telegram to the president and release all these press releases, trying to call attention to the refugees. So she was very, very politically active. She was politically active ever since she was young, just about, different issues, very sort of Norwegian centered issues. And then she becomes sort of much more vocal internationally. For that, she's frequently contrasted, not necessarily in her own life, but now a good contrast would be Knut Hamsun, who's also a Nobel Prize winning, very good, magnificent writer, but who was incredibly pro-Nazi, to the point that he moved to Germany to further support the Nazi regime and met with Hitler. So they're an interesting contrast in how Norwegians reacted to the situation.
Yeah, it took a lot of courage to be a woman and to be speaking of those things at a time when not everybody was completely on board.
Mm-hmm.
But to see it firsthand, if you're fleeing from the Nazis, you understand,
Mm-hmm.
no, these people are bad. So that's cool.
Yes, absolutely. She had been writing about it for a very long time. Her works had been banned in Germany. Interestingly enough, her former husband had actually been much more sympathetic to the Nazis. He'd written an article kind of not necessarily supporting their political regime, but sort of supporting them culturally, basically, kind of interested in their what they were doing.
Can I
Gillette,
ask you, oh
no, go ahead. Somebody has a question.
No, Laura Michelle, I just wanted to know if you have written any articles about Sigrid Undset's time in the US, because I don't think most people would know that she spent 4 or 5 years in exile, living in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm. I haven't actually written any articles. I've given a number of papers at medieval conferences, because one of her close friends is actually a quite famous medievalist, Hope Emily Allen, who identified the original manuscript of Marjorie Kemp, who is a medieval mystic, and they were great friends, correspondents. They visited each other, and so I've given papers on her time in the U.S., but I've never published anything. I've just sort of went straight to, writing a chapter for the biography. But I agree that it's fascinating, and I think that's probably what first convinced me that I could in fact write this biography, that there was so much to say about her that people who had never read Kristin Lavransdatter would be interested in hearing.
Well, plus you have the perfect background because you have the interest in the medieval time period and women, and that's what I think makes such a good approach for your book.
Well, thank you. And I'm such an admirer of Tiina and her translations. Her new translations, I think, have made all the difference with particularly the Olav Audunssøn books. They had the original ones, and they were still the original ones from when they were first published, right after she wrote them. I just think they had this very, I don't know, everyone spoke like they were at a Renaissance festival. It seemed like it just, and I think that sort of took away some of that, some of the starkness of the dialogue, which is very reminiscent, intentionally so, of saga language, which I think she was really trying to imitate. Oh, sorry, I'm just seeing some questions. Yes, the memoir of escaping Norway is in English. So I can go ahead and send Lina a link to it, or a bibliography if people are interested.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a fascinating, far beyond what I expected. So this is just really great that you could do this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions from Shelley or Gillette that we should cover?
Well, I mean, I have thousands, but
yeah, right.
We're running towards the end of time. But it really sounds fascinating. It's like the stories she wrote are fascinating. Her life story is like a novel.
Yeah.
I mean, 1865 to 1945 with the World War II and the Holocaust was one of my fields in grad school in history. And so that part is like kind of fascinating to me to discover like all these people and what they were doing and how their lives were affected too. And then, yeah, and then the understanding about the translation is all just a lot of really awesome stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank
We
you.
really appreciate it. Hopefully, if we end up doing that whole thing where we have everybody come to Wadena to have a large author event for all the Zoom ones, it would be awesome to see you guys.
Oh, I would love that. That would be fantastic.
Thank you. We're hoping for August next year.
All right, wonderful. I'll be on sabbatical, so that will be great.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us all this great information and things to now have our winter reading list, I think.
Absolutely.
Thank
If
you.
anyone has any questions, my email address is, you can Google it through the Marshall website because I teach in the history department. It's my last name at marshall.edu. So I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any references.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much
again.
for joining us. Yes. And we look forward to meeting you next year.
Thank you.